Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the dark night of the soul. Alright, so in today's video I'm going to be talking to you about the dark night of the soul. I'll also be talking about my own personal experiences with dark night of the soul so you can get a sense of what that's like, and basically how to actually kind of speed up the process of the dark night of the soul so that you're not languishing there forever if that's where you happen to be. So what the dark night of the soul is it's actually part of the process of becoming more conscious. It's where you have, let's say, a certain paradigm, and then you maybe have certain experiences or certain awakenings that basically like overturn that paradigm. And so it's basically like things are ordered and then they become very chaotic, and then basically it sets you up to have an actually, let's say, higher, more expansive ordered paradigm afterward. But that middling phase, that liminal phase between the more narrow paradigm and the more expanded paradigm, it's where things get really, really messy. And so the dark night of the soul is associated with a loss of meaning and sort of almost like a feeling of being up the creek without a paddle, not understanding. It's like having the entire floor of your paradigm yanked out from under you, or losing your religion, losing your cosmology. And so this loss of meaning can be something that's very, very difficult for a human being, because our worldview basically is the foundation upon which we scaffold our identity. And so if we go through, let's say 30 years of our life, 40 years of our life, believing the world is one way, and we've built up an identity based off of the way that we believe the world to be and the paradigm that we sort of overlay onto the world, when it's the case that we start to wake up and expand our paradigm, this is like having the rug yanked out from under you. And it can create this sense of almost like, tumbling head over feet, in a meaningless universe, and it can bring you into feelings of nihilism and futility and meaninglessness. And so the dark night of the soul can be a very depressive place to be, and it can be a very chaotic place to be. So I like to think about it a bit like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. So when the caterpillar is a caterpillar, life is a certain way. There's a certain ordering principle about the caterpillar, right? And then basically you have the cocoon period, and the cocoon period is like the dark night of the soul. So the caterpillar goes into the cocoon, and contrary to popular belief, the caterpillar doesn't just grow wings. What ends up happening is that the caterpillar actually dissolves down into this like primordial goo, and from that primordial goo, that's where the butterfly is actually formed. And so basically in the cocoon, the caterpillar completely disintegrates. All of the form of what was previous goes away, except for a few different elements of the caterpillar that stay the same. And then basically they get remade as a whole different being entirely. And so it basically goes order, chaos, and then higher order. So basically it's the dark night of the soul is that, let's say, cocoon phase. It's that chaotic period before things recoalesce into a higher order. Or let's say like you have a bookshelf, and you have more books than can actually fit on your bookshelf. Well, what's going to happen is you're going to have to take all your books out of the bookshelf, and you're going to have to either get a new, let's say, bigger bookshelf, or you're going to have to build out the bookshelf that you have. But you see, things will get messy in that period of time. You're going to have to take all the books out of the bookshelf. You have to essentially undermine the original order in order to make room for the new order. And so it's sort of like you have to go through the catabolic phase that is the dark night of the soul before you go into the anabolic phase of like rebuilding things. Now I'll give my personal experience of how the dark night of the soul came about for me, and it was about, I would say, probably about a 5-year period of time where I was really floundering in the dark night of the soul. So basically when I was 20 years old, so I had 20 years built up of, let's say, certain ideas about myself, certain ideas about how the world worked. And so basically the way that I conceptualized of the world, and it was like working out quite well for me, is I saw reality as being sort of a venue through which to, let's say, express my individuality. And it was all about, let's say, trying to achieve more and trying to individuate more, trying to almost like improve myself constantly. And the way that I was thinking about the world was that basically a person is as valuable as what they do and what they contribute. And so the idea was that, oh, I have to keep achieving and I have to keep, going to higher heights, because the more I do that, the more existentially valid I am. Whereas if I don't do that, then I'm totally existentially invalid. And so my view of reality was that it was basically like a big hierarchy and a big competition. And so I was constantly competing in my mind to make sure that I was toward the top of that hierarchy so that I could be deemed a valid person. And so it was all about, how can I set myself aside from other people? How can I become the most unique? How can I add the most value to myself? How do I become the most self-improved? How do I become the highest and best version of myself? And so basically this whole idea had ruled my life in a certain way, but it especially became very strong once I hit like age 16. So once I hit 16, everything in my life was about building this ideal identity, being able to achieve things. And then basically what ended up happening when I was 20 years old is that everything started falling apart. My identity was basically scaffolded upon the idea of never failing and always succeeding and always being able to come out on top, which of course that's like building my identity as a house of cards anyway. So I was kind of setting myself up for a huge dark night of the soul anyway. But basically it was during this time where all of the things that I was believing, all of the things that I was thinking about myself, all of that started to fall away and drop away. And it also happened to be, let's say, the time where I first experienced, let's say, plant medicine. And so both of these two things were like coming in directly into that experience. And so it was like this sense that my worldview and my identity were failing me. And then in my plant medicine experiences at the time, what I experienced was this sense of oneness that I had never experienced before. And so I went into the experience with a very secular perspective, and just kind of thinking about, let's say, reality as being something about trying to make myself valid by achieving things, in some way. And what I experienced was basically like the complete opposite of that. So it's like this awareness of oneness came up, and I felt like this sense of ultimate connection with all things, the sense that I would look up at the sky and recognize that there was no distinction between myself and the rest of the universe, like they were all one thing. And it was also this sense that I didn't need to do anything or achieve anything to be valid. I was simply valid exactly as I was. It was okay for me to just be. I didn't have to achieve in order to deserve existing. And I also recognized, this is a big paradigm shift for me as well, because prior to this, I was like agnostic, leaning pretty heavily atheist because of kind of the way that I was thinking about, let's say, God and spirituality. I was kind of like, I'm pretty sure there's not some guy up in the clouds. Like that was like my view. And then I had in the experience of this oneness and in the experience of this absolute okayness of myself, it was like, oh, this is what that is. And so it created this total shift of my perspective, all in one fell swoop. And in that experience, it's basically all of the parts of myself that I had rejected in my previous paradigm, in my previous worldview. All of those came up to the surface, and in the experience, I actually experienced a lot of integration. It was almost like all of these parts of myself had been pushed to the peripheries, and on some semi-conscious level, I still knew they were there. But then all of a sudden, in this expansion of consciousness, all of those parts of myself that I had rejected came up, and I felt this sense of wholeness, and all of my suffering dropped away. And I, for the first time in my life, experienced unconditional love. And, basically it was this very beautiful experience. And I had two such experiences like this during this time frame. And, as lovely as those experiences were, this is what kickstarted the dark night of the soul. So basically, my whole entire paradigm failed me. My identity had failed me. And, then I had all of these experiences, knowing that it is possible to experience self-love, knowing that it is possible to feel connected with all things, knowing that there is a perspective that I can take where I can be whole in myself. But the thing is like I went back into my day-to-day lived experience now with these two warring paradigms. And so I had this basically very meritocratic, like, life is about achievement kind of paradigm. And then I had this awareness of this more spiritual paradigm where everything is absolutely okay and there's this sense of belonging. And so both of these paradigms warred inside of me. And all of the different coping mechanisms that I had built for myself were based in this like meritocratic paradigm. And so I was always trying to find some way to make things work out. And I had like lost my ability to function with innocence, in this paradigm. And so I ended up fighting against myself. So one of the things that happened in that experience of that more expansive paradigm is that basically the idea of emerald was just recognized as an idea, so there was like an ego transcendence. And so what I was trying to do was I was basically trying to undermine my identity. And so I would sometimes purposefully do things to try to embarrass myself in order to almost beat up on my ego in some kind of way. Or I would let's say, always just almost be totally in resistance to being a separate individual, almost like trying to forget that I'm emerald, trying to reject the notion of my entire humanity. And then there would also be I would typically want to achieve things, but then I forced myself to not achieve things even when it would feel right to do so. And then there was also this awareness of oneness, and I was okay, well, if I'm one with everything, what's to stop me from going out in traffic if there's no distinction between me and anything else? And of course I never did that because I'm still here, but it's one of those things where it was I had these two different paradigms that were at play, that one that I had memories of and an awareness of, and then the one that I was used to operating off of. And so I was in this space of real confusion and always trying to go for those more top shelf spiritual truths that I had experienced in those experiences. And so it was really this experience of making myself so much smaller and, being kind of at the mercy of my paradigm, not knowing if I'm doing the right thing or if I'm doing the wrong thing, which is very different than what I experienced previously in my previous paradigm. Before, I knew what life was about. Before, life was just continue to improve yourself, continue to make yourself a better person, continue to just climb the mountain. My life was just climbing the mountain. It was easy to understand. It was difficult, but it was easy. Whereas this other paradigm, it was a simple paradigm, but it was so difficult to implement. And so I was in this in-between phase where I had no idea what to do. And so for about 4 or 5 years, I really floundered before I could really figure out how to reconcile these paradigms. And at that point, I had developed, let's say, a more multi-perspectival way of thinking, where I could hold on to, let's say, the more practical truths, and I could hold on to the more spiritual truths, and I could think from different angles. And so instead of, let's say, bringing in the spiritual truths and kind of negating all of the practical truths, I started to be able to recognize that there's a different way to orient in the relative than there is in the absolute. So in the relative, there's no absolute up or down, or there's no absolute, there's no dichotomies, in the absolute. But basically in the relative there are, and I have to function in reality that way. And so basically a lot of my process of coming out of the dark night of the soul was to be able to reconcile, let's say, the broader, more expansive paradigm with the more contracted paradigm of day-to-day life, and to be able to hold on to both of those things at once. And also another part of it was to be able to recognize that I get to make my own meaning, so it's not as to say that, let's say with the meritocratic viewpoint, I was just thinking that, okay, this is just the way the universe works. People who achieve more are worth more than people who don't achieve as much, and so I want to achieve more. So there was this very dogmatic kind of way of looking at the universe at the time. And now it was okay, I get to decide, is achieving things, important to me as itself? Or are there elements of that that I like? Are there elements of that that I find meaningful? So instead of it being this imaginary standard that I'm projecting out onto the universe that I have to match up to, now I get to recognize that my meaning is internally derived. And now I can kind of look at things through all of these different lenses and to be able to experience meaning, because it's important for human beings to have a sense of meaning. And so it totally, in this process, shifted my relationship to meaning entirely. And, basically, though this process can be very, very difficult, and it was for me very difficult. It was a very depressing process at certain points in the journey. But ultimately, the product of that process really shifted my entire perspective on myself, my life, the world, and it's created so much more of an expansive perspective than what it was that I had before. So it's basically like my perspective was this before, and now my perspective is this. But to get from this to this, there's usually a lot of chaos and a lot of confusion to go from this to this. So that's basically my story of Dark Night of the Soul. And so I'm going to be telling you a bit more about, let's say, how to orient to Dark Night of the Soul, and also some important information about it. Now, what I would say as a caveat here is that you don't want to put yourself in a dark night of the soul on purpose. If it happens, it happens, but as much as possible, try to avoid it. And one of the ways to do that is to go about your inner work process, gradually and very, very gently. So being able to expand your paradigm a little bit at a time allows you to not bite off more than you can chew. And, it might be a slower going process to get from here to here, but it's something that tends to be more stable. What I would say about my experiences is that because I had this immediate paradigm shift, and basically my whole entire paradigm got turned on its ear, and now all of the stuff that was in the shadow just came up to the surface all of a sudden, even though it was a beautiful experience in the moment. In the moment it was like, oh, there's this reunification with all these parts of myself that I had pushed away. But going back into my default perspective, it felt more like I popped a bubble inside of my psyche and all the demons came out, because I didn't know how to basically put, I didn't know what places to put those parts of myself. And so what I would say is that as you're going through and you're doing inner work or you're doing shadow work, to try to go about it as gently as possible. Try to take it slowly so you don't end up in like a big tower moment like I was in, where the whole entire tower falls apart and then you have to rebuild it again from scratch. Ideally, that's the situation that you're in. So don't try to get into the dark night of the soul. So this is more information about, let's say, if you want to prepare yourself for the signs of the dark night of the soul, or if you're already in it, and how to essentially work through it in a more productive way so that you don't have to spend as much time there. Now, one of the things that's important to mention as it comes to Dark Night of the Soul is to recognize the inherent epistemological blind spot that people are in. So the nature of being a human being is to not know anything beyond a shadow of a doubt. So Socrates had this quote that was something like, "I know I'm the wisest man, for I know that I know nothing." And basically this is in the absolute sense, we as human beings can't know anything beyond a shadow of a doubt, because we only have the limitations of our own subjective perspective. So we never get to see behind anyone else's eyes, and we never get to see outside of the range of what our sensory experiences take in. And so because we're in this fundamentally limited perspective, we really can't know anything for sure. So if I say this shirt is black, well, ultimately you might agree with me, but let's say we're seeing totally different colors, but we just happen to call them the same thing. So I can't know that for sure. No one can ever know that for sure, because nobody gets to see behind the eyes of anyone else. And so because human beings are in this blind spot, just living as a human being requires a human being to adopt a certain cosmology to fill in the blanks, and to be able to practice a kind of faith in that cosmology. So it's basically everyone has a religion. Now that doesn't mean that everyone is spiritual or that everyone believes in God. That's not what I'm saying. What I mean is that everybody has a paradigm that they're exercising faith in, because we're all fundamentally in this blind spot. So we're always having to fill in the blanks. So it's always always human nature to always be dancing with that mystery. But human beings have a difficult time dealing with uncertainty. And so we try to fill in the blanks and we try to have certain understandings about what reality is. And so basically we believe that, let's say, the world functions a certain way. We have, certain ideas about what our place is in the universe. And while some of those things might be for some people empirically observable, there's going to be many, many things, no matter how much someone's perspective is rooted in empiricism. Let's say there's going to be many elements of that person's reality that they're going to have to just fill in the blanks. And so in this sense, everyone has a cosmology, everyone has a worldview, everyone has a religion that they're exercising faith in. And ultimately, it's the platform of this cosmology upon which our identity is scaffolded. And so, let's say if I have a more secular cosmology or something like that, or if I have a more religious cosmology, there's going to be certain ways of, like, let's say, slotting into that worldview and finding my place in the world and defining my own identity. Either way, that's going to lead me to be like, oh, this is what I can do to be successful. This is what I can do to be a good person, or this is what it means to be this or that. And so these platforms that we essentially create or are handed down to us by our society or our family, these are very, very important to us. And we tend to hold on very, very tightly to our worldview because it is basically the foundation upon which our ego is built. And so when it's the case that we experience, let's say, something that overturns some foundational stone of our worldview, this is where we can start to deal with the instability that might lead to the dark night of the soul. So let's say, for example, if I am raised, one example that I like to use actually, let's say I'm the pharaoh in ancient Egypt. And basically my identity as the pharaoh slots into a very specific worldview, a very specific cosmology. And so let's say if somebody comes from, let's say, another place in the world, so let's say that, somebody comes from like Greece or something like that, and they have a totally different pantheon and a totally different cosmology. And so basically, if I really consider their cosmology as potentially true, then it leads me to say, okay, well, maybe the ancient Egyptian cosmology actually is not true. And what does that say about my place in the universe as the pharaoh? And so basically, it can be quite an existential crisis. The more absolutely we believe in our worldview, and the more we scaffold our identity upon it, hearing a worldview that contradicts from it can really feel like this huge threat to our own ego and our own place in the universe. And so when it comes to expanding our paradigm, one of the things that we can do is we can hold on to our worldview very, very loosely. That way, if we get some kind of information, or maybe even some kind of truth that we receive that, let's say, maybe undermines our worldview, that we're able to absorb that and to expand our paradigm as a result, as opposed to just going into cognitive dissonance and let's say, kind of struggling internally either with, let's say, doubt in our own self and doubt in our own perspective, or let's say, feeling like we need to just reject whatever truth comes up. So the more expansive we can be and the more open-minded we can be, the more that we're going to be able to invite in new truths to our worldview. But the more tightly we hold on to our worldview and the more tightly we hold on to our identity that's scaffolded upon that worldview, the more that we're going to reject any kind of truth that gets in the way, because it's that makes our perspective very fragile, and it's that which makes our perspective a house of cards. And cognitive dissonance is basically the process that we use to keep that house of cards standing, because we're trying to ultimately keep things stable, keep things in homeostasis, and to avoid things being toppled over. So in order to do this, in order to hold on to our worldview loosely, is to recognize that you don't know for sure what is true. Always to be a human being is to be a blind man touching an elephant. So there's a parable about a bunch of blind men that are like touching different parts of an elephant. And so one of them touches the trunks and says, oh yeah, the nature of the elephant is that it's very smooth. And then another one touches like the ear and says, oh no, it's not smooth, it's kind of crinkly and floppy. And another one like touches touches its side, it's like, oh no, it's very, very like strong, and it's very, very like almost like sandpaper, So basically it's like all of these different perspectives coming from these like blind men about the elephant itself. Well, ultimately is, let's say, a parable that shows our relationship to reality at large, our relationship to the universe. We only ever see certain facets of the truth. We have a limited perspective. So we never get to take off our blindfold and see the whole elephant. We're always going to be blindfolded and always dealing with certain facets of reality. And so the more that we can recognize that we are a blind man touching the elephant when it comes to our experience of reality, the more that we're going to be able to basically allow in new things to be true that, like, let's say that maybe if we held on to our paradigm, like, let's say more strongly, we wouldn't be able to accept. So let's say if I'm the blind man touching the elephant that, I'm touching the tusks, and then suddenly I found out that, oh, actually the elephant isn't all smooth. It actually has some rough parts too. If I'm very, very held on to my idea that, oh, the elephant is all smooth, then, that's going to be something that's going to be a real shocker, and it's going to pull my entire paradigm out from under me. Whereas if I can hold space for the fact that things can be this way and they can be that way too, then it's going to be a lot less of a blow to my paradigm. Now, I'm a life coach, and I've worked with a good number of clients who have gone through a crisis of faith. So basically, I would say that people who are coming from a particular religious tradition are more likely to experience this than people who are fairly non-religious. And the reason why that is because the broader society, like the general set point of broader society, is a little bit more secular and non-religious, whereas, like, let's say you have kind of almost like pockets of different, like, let's say religious sects and things like that. And within the context of those communities, those religions can be believed in kind of an absolute sort of fundamentalistic way. And so what oftentimes ends up happening is that in order for a person to kind of stay believing in a religion in kind of a fundamentalist way, they have to kind of almost always like talk to people from within that religious group, or they have to avoid certain types of knowledge and things like that. And so it's a lot more common for somebody who, let's say, was raised in a very specific religion to end up in a situation where they come across information or they come across people that start to like undermine their worldview, undermine their viewpoint about things. And so with that, I've experienced, working with quite a few people who, let's say, were raised in a particular religious environment and then experienced that kind of existential rug being pulled out from under them, where, maybe other paradigms come in that challenge, let's say, the absoluteness of their viewpoint. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who have experienced this, cease to be, let's say, religious people. Oftentimes, like, what feels like the end in those moments is really just an expansion and a deepening of, let's say, their connection to their own religious experience. While other people might go to more, let's say, more secular viewpoints, or, might go into a different religion, or, things like that. So people who deal with crises of faith have different ways of dealing with it. But it's been very interesting as somebody who, let's say, has been raised in a fairly secular way in a secular society to kind of see how, let's say, somebody's perspective can be sort of undermined by the wider culture. And then, there's a chaos period, and it's like, it's almost like I said, the floor gets yanked out from under them. But another thing to kind of keep in mind is that if you're talking to somebody who is in a space of, like, let's say, they're in, let's say, a group of people that believe in things in a very, very kind of rigid way, understanding that, like, if, let's say, you approach them with some kind of truth and they reject it, oftentimes that's that cognitive dissonance that's necessary to keep themselves stable and in a state of homeostasis and to try to avoid the dark night of the soul. And so if you're a person that's like, oh, why can't they just see this truth, or why can't they just see that truth, then the reason why is that ultimately, the dark night of the soul is like a huge thing to embark upon. And so what I would recommend is that if you run across somebody who is, like, let's say, held on to like a very, very specific viewpoint and can't expand their paradigm past it, is to not really push them past it too much. It's like, it's a journey that, is an optional journey. Like, a person could spend their whole entire time, their whole entire life in this, like, let's say, narrower paradigm, and they will be just fine for it. So there's no need to kind of push someone into a dark night of the soul, if they're not ready to go on it. Now, one of the things that tends to come up with dark night of the soul is warring paradigms and not really knowing which paradigm is the right one to go off of. And, it's like this a total loss of meaning. But within these warring paradigms, a big part of it is being able to hold space for multiple paradigms at once. So instead of looking at things through just one lens, being able to look at things through a variety of different lenses. And so what I was experiencing was this clashing between, like, okay, is this more spiritual awareness true? Or is this like more, let's say, down to earth kind of day-to-day awareness where I'm a separate human being that has to make it in the world somehow? Is that true? And ultimately I had to recognize that both of those things are true at once, and to be able to hold space for paradoxes. So the paradoxes would be like, oh, everything is all one, but everything is separate. So those two things feel like they would be mutually exclusive statements. So it's like, logically, if everything is all one, then everything can't be separate. And if everything is separate, then it can't be all one. But it's being able to recognize that there are two different vantage points to take, and to be able to, switch between paradigms consciously. So if I'm speaking from the spiritual perspective, it's like, I'm going to be able to say that, oh yeah, everything is all one and everything is connected, and at the baseline of everything is unconditionally loving. If I go to the relative perspective, the more down to earth perspective, it's kind of like, okay, well, everybody here is functioning as separate individuals, and not everyone is perfectly loving, and nothing is perfect here, and that sort of thing. And so it's being able to hold space for both of those things, and to reconcile them in the sense that you recognize that, even though they sound logically that like they don't go together, or that they would clash, or that they would negate one another, that because they're on these two different perspectives, they don't, So what sounds like a paradox isn't actually a paradox. And so becoming multi-perspectival is very, very important for being able to move through the dark night of the soul. So being willing to put on this lens whenever it's appropriate, take off that lens and put on this other lens. And, so we could say that, somebody who is multi-perspectival can look at the world through the scientific lens. They can look at the world through a more spiritual lens. They can look at the world through, let's say, a more objective perspective. They can look at the world through the more subjective perspective. They can look from the vantage points of a variety of different philosophies. And basically they can utilize logic to be able to say, okay, if this is true, then that would make sense that this would also be true. And so it's being able to kind of switch lenses out, and to be able to recognize that truth isn't always just one way, and that, ultimately, because we don't know the absolute truth of things, we can try on a lot of different perspectives, and we can see what appears to be true to us. And so basically being able to expand your paradigm to include multiple perspectives is what's going to help you in that process to get from, let's say, your more contracted, narrow perspective to a more expansive perspective. But it'll help you navigate that internal space of, being in the liminal space of going from, this earlier perspective to this later, more wider perspective. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button down below and subscribe, and leave me a comment down below. Also, if you would like to learn about shadow work, I have a free shadow integration masterclass called the 6 Simple Steps to Shadow Integration. If you would like to check that out, go to shadowintegration.org/masterclass. I also have it linked down below in the description box and in the comments. Anyway, that's all I have for you for now, and until next time, keep becoming more you.